Today we will be introducing you to the utilitarian philosophy of John Stuart Mill. He, along with another philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, came up with this philosophy, which is one of the most famous ethical philosophies. So, British philosopher, 1806 to 1873. Utilitarianism is a consequentialism philosophy. Basically, to summarize, we think of the consequences of any behavior to try to find out if the behavior is right or wrong based on the future consequences. So, a little glossary. Utilitarianism is a philosophy designed to maximize utility. What's utility? They described it as a measure of happiness. The thing that we want more than anything else: happiness, pleasure, satisfaction, utility. And so utilitarianism saw life. We can either have pleasurable experiences, which would give us utility, and we'd want to at the same time minimize any painful experiences, which obviously would be the opposite of utility. So this happiness principle: an action is right in proportion as it tends to promote happiness, and it's wrong as it tends to produce the reverse. Pretty basic. Ultimately, the idea of utilitarianism is to try to have as much possible utility or pleasure as you can for the greatest amount of people. That's the John Stuart Mill variant on utilitarianism. It just doesn't look at what's best for me in the future consequences, but rather it tries to get you to calculate what would be the greatest good for the greatest number. The consequences that the most people would benefit from would be the action that is right. Sometimes that doesn't mean me. So, for instance, say the COVID lockdowns during in businesses in Los Angeles and then in New York, keeping restaurants closed. That's terrible if you own a tattoo shop or a bar or a restaurant or a movie theater, for the business to be told by the government you have to shut down. But in essence, what the government's saying is, for the greater good, so that COVID is not spread at a more rapid rate, we're going to close your business. And for the individual, it's not always a good thing. And we can obviously argue the politics and whether lockdowns work, but that's an example of the greatest good for the greatest number. Some are going to get screwed. The ideas of whether or not my intention is good, like I want to do the right thing, or whether or not there's any virtues involved, we don't think about those at all. Utilitarianism simply says greatest good for the greatest number, whatever the answer is the right thing to do. So, the positives of utilitarianism is we do this all of the time, on a daily basis. We're trying to figure out what line is going to get us out of the grocery store quicker, and we wait in that checkout line, or we try to think about a shortcut to avoid traffic. We're always trying to predict the consequences, and we're trying to factor in what's the best choice, what's the good choice based on the consequences. The good outweighs the bad, then that action is moral. We already do this. Another positive utilitarianism for many is it does not in any way have any sort of biblical God religious connotation. Some people who are religious, something is right or wrong based on the Bible or the Quran or whatever the church says. Utilitarianism takes that right or wrong completely away from any godlike connection and says something is right or wrong based on the positive consequence for the most people. Well, negatives of utilitarianism. The whole idea of utility is saying the one thing that we all want that will give us the most use or utility is happiness. Some philosophers have said maybe happiness isn't the best possible thing we should hope for. Do you remember we did the experience machine of Robert Nozick, the idea of putting yourself hooked up to some computer and you can have any positive experience, any pleasurable experience? Kids said they didn't want to do it because life is more than just the happiness. It has to be real. There has to be setbacks. There has to be accomplishments. Well, maybe utilitarianism says happiness is number one. Maybe that's not the main thing we should want out of life. They've argued that maybe something like justice or righteousness is more important. And if everyone's just going around trying to make themselves happy, where is the honor? Where is the justice? We would ignore those things. Maybe trying to maximize the most happiness isn't what we should be doing. Maybe the most fair? Another negative of utilitarianism has to do with the concept nobody knows the future. At any moment when I try to decide whether or not I'm going to do an action, and I think of the future consequences, who knows what's going to happen in the future? Maybe a tree gets cut down on the way through my shortcut, or somebody, the checkout line I get into that's short, unfortunately I didn't factor in the old guy who's paying with pennies. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, so how can we predict whether or not an action is going to be good based on a future that's not certain? We're only guessing. We only have an opinion. Probably, though, the biggest negative of utilitarianism is it leads to the idea of the ends justifying the means. What does that mean? Well, the idea is any action is good if the outcome is good. Well, is it possible that something is bad or cruel, clearly as an action, might lead to a good consequence? If it's saying that, then it says that no matter what you do, if the result is good, it's worthwhile. Like killing somebody, doing terrible things, if it results in a good consequence, then I'm okay. The little cartoon talks about torture as an example of this. So there's two different ways of looking at it. Top quote, the end justifies the means. Sometimes you have to do the wrong thing to get the right result. And people could argue if that's true or not. And then at the bottom you have Ayn Rand. The end does not justify the means. No one's rights can be secured by the violation of the rights of others. In other words, if you do something bad to some, you can't say that it's good for others. Look, honey, I'm famous. The ends always justify the means. And then you look at the little cartoon, dog pees on woman, too stupid to move. Sometimes the things we need to do to get the proper consequence, it's pretty dangerous to say that they're good. Example of Hitler and Stalin. I mean, I don't think the perspective of a Jewish minority is going to be looking at what was done to them by Hitler and the Aryan Nazis, but Hitler could say the bad that's we're doing done through the Nuremberg Acts are justified for the end result. Stalin could say the slaughtering of millions of his own people is what Russia needed to do to become its strong communist state. It's very dangerous philosophy to say the end justifies the means. Probably the most glaring example that kids don't think about is what we do in terms of animal testing. The idea is sometimes it's mice, but sometimes it's bunnies, and sometimes it's monkeys that have to be tested upon so that we can find medicines that work, so that man is better off. Well, I've had kids argue, but wait, you're torturing these animals? Well, we're not torturing them, but we've got to spray some sort of, shampoo in their eyes to see if it's a tearless shampoo. And some of them don't work, so the animals are crying or much, much worse. That's an example of the end justifying the means mentality. Next we come to John Stuart Mill's famous harm principle. The quote, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So his book on liberty basically tries to show the limits that government should have in regards to what power they have over us, the people. What can they say we should or should not do? The idea of John Stuart Mill in the harm principle, he said, if an action only affects us, the person who's doing the action, then society should back off. They have no right to get involved and try to stop us. Even if what we're doing is harming us, as long as it's not harming others, society and government has no right to tell the individual what they should or should not do. You've often might heard it said, like, what I do in the privacy of my own home. The idea is whatever you're doing, if it's not harming others, John Stuart Mill said government and society should leave you alone. Your right to swing your arm leaves off where my right not to have my nose struck begins. In other words, as soon as that guy is punched, his rights have been violated. You've harmed him. Therefore, you don't have the right to do it. Anything else, you have the right to do unless it harms someone else. The only justification for the government to get involved is if we're going to harm others. So me drunk driving could harm somebody else. That should be done away with. Well, then a kid asked me last year, well, how about the seatbelt rule? who's that harming? And I said, well, potentially your family if you get hurt in the accident, or the paramedics who are going to have to pick your body off the ground. But the idea of John Stuart Mill, he said, we have the right to have self-regarding actions. I choose what's best for me. Imagine that. And I should have the liberty to choose what's best for me. If I want to, do something that society deems as illegal, well, unless it's harming someone else, we should be allowed to do what we like. That was his view on freedom and liberty. So, what are your thoughts on this? Should I be able to do whatever I want to do? The vague area is when it comes to some personal choices. Seatbelts I mentioned. How about smoking? Smoking, they've said secondhand smoke, and that's clearly a reason why I shouldn't be able to smoke in the bar or restaurant. The example of the banning of the big gulp sodas in New York, they had a law that said, I believe, you can't get more than 64 ounces at a time in one of these big gulps. The cartoon over there, that they have to hide it because of drones flying overhead. The idea is, you know what, nobody should be drinking that much sugary water. We get that. But if they want to, who is the government to tell them they can't? And the idea is, well, what if we realize that their decision is harming more than them? They might get poor health or diabetes, but then later on when they are collecting medical benefits via Medicaid or Medicare, that's being paid by everybody else. In other words, the way our medicine works, it's not 100% just us paying for our own medicine for healthcare. For some groups, you do have transfer payments involved. At what point should the government get involved? I mean, in the issue, I had a discussion with someone about the government telling us that we should or shouldn't wear masks. If a law is put into place, they would follow the law, but just one governor saying, hey, put your mask on, says who? Well, apparently the governor. But if people have voted on it, he said it's okay. The person argued to me, my best friend had COVID, it wasn't a problem. Why should I have to wear a mask? We could debate whether or not they're harming others with that. I'm just trying to get your mind thinking about the ethics of the harm principle. Paternalism versus soft paternalism. Paternalism is a word coming from the root pater, which means father. When should the government be able to limit our personal freedom? What if the government says the thing we're doing is wrong? It's for our own good. The idea of John Stuart Mill says we know what's best for us. The government shouldn't try to protect us because trying to protect us is keeping us from doing what we want. We need individual freedoms. He said the individual is the person most interested in his own well-being. Society interfering to overrule his judgment may be altogether wrong. Who else knows what's best for me than me is the viewpoint. He does make a distinction with something called soft paternalism. This is the only time government should get involved, and it's when we want to make sure the person is knowledgeable about whatever risky thing they're about to interact with. In other words, cigarette labels in other countries now have, a fetus or a black lung to actually show you the warning. You can still buy the cigarettes, or the idea of a lifeguard on duty, or the famous example of a damaged bridge. We must have a sign letting people know it's damaged. If they choose to go through the bridge after they've been informed, then what role should the government have to obstruct them? Obviously, this is just a view. If a bridge is, it's a trespassing charge. But his idea is the government, it's not their job to tell people what they should and shouldn't do, with the exception of soft paternalism, where they just want to make sure they're educated in their choice. He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preparing either opinion. Generally speaking, we tend to know one side of an argument, and he's saying you should be more open-minded to realize both sides. So open-mindedness. He said that the government should only be able to restrict freedoms in a few different distinctions. One, in terms of thought and expression, that we should be able to think what we want, that the idea that the silencing of our opinion is robbing the human race of an opportunity of exchanging error for truth, that we can fix the problems of our thinking with different possible thoughts, and freedom of thought being so important. Freedom of taste and pursuits to do what we want to do unless it harms others. That which seems the height of absurdity in one generation often becomes the height of wisdom in the next. The idea, if you look at 1950s and rock and roll, and it was the devil's music because Elvis was shaking his hips, and then you see how society progresses, oftentimes something that seems weird and shocking in future generations will be actually taken as common fact. If all mankind, minus one person, were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. We shouldn't always just go with one viewpoint, but alternate viewpoints have value. That was the belief of John Stuart Mill's open-mindedness. Liberty lies in the rights of that person whose views you find the most odious. Odious is terrible, awful. And the idea is people should have the right to their own opinions. Individuality and happiness. He thought that freedom in thought and action was how we would find out new, better ways of living. Different ways that life could be gone through only comes from being an individual and having freedom. So that government should not try to take away this originality, this innovation that the individual can have. Mill said, the more freedom you have to find what makes you happy, the happier you will be. So hopefully the ability of a creative individual to actually pursue what they want, they can come up with new ingenious ways of thinking. Genius can breathe freely only in an atmosphere of freedom. Persons of genius, it is true, are and are always likely to be a small minority. But in order to have them, it's necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Just look at the idea of light bulbs or cell phones. Somebody came up with that idea, and I guarantee you people in the beginning thought they were crazy, because it makes no sense. If you brought a cell phone back to 1840s, they'd think you were some sort of, a witch. The idea of geniuses can only bloom when we have, as he said, the soil in which they can grow. He was completely against censorship. He thought censorship was the enemy of progress. Even if they're negative, bad opinions that you disagree with, the difference of opinion and free discussion will allow us to find better ways of living. And he felt we needed to be more tolerant and understanding of others' views. And in that way, we can actually be more open-minded and we can find new paths and better ways to live. Now, the question is, should non-politically correct comments be protected? Now we have things like hate speech. Politically correct are things you should say and you shouldn't say. According to Mill, you can't be harmed by words. Remember the harm principle. That being the case, he generally felt that no speech should be stopped. There should be no censorship. He said actual harm is different from having your feelings being affected. He said ultimately we should be able to say what we want to say. That's definitely not a viewpoint that's okay today in a politically correct society. What is now called the nature of women is an eminently artificial thing, the result of forced repression in some directions, unnatural stimulation in others. John Stuart Mill was one of the first philosophers Western philosophers to take up the power of women and say that they should not be subjected or made somehow different and lesser than men. And he calls it an artificial thing. It's something that mankind has basically done. It's forced repression, meaning women can't do certain things because of society, and then unnatural stimulation in others. Women are supposed to do so women are supposed to do the child raising. That is the belief of society. It's not necessarily written in any stone. His idea of feminism, he waited until the end of life to actually publish it because it was very radical. It was very different, and he didn't think it would be great for his career, so he published it at the end of his life. He said, if freedom is good for men, then it should be good for women too. This makes pretty much sense. He said this whole idea that there's some sort of a different nature of men and women, that we are somehow different in anything other than, genitalia, is based on nothing but opinion. I mean, women can be scientists, women can be steel workers, men can be raising the kids, as it were. He believed that oppressing women and keeping them down was one of the last parts or remnants of ancient thinking. And until we got rid of this sort of men above women mindset, that we would not have any societal progress as well as we could have, in terms of it was a large barrier. Marriage is the only actual bondage known to our law. There remain no legal slaves except the mistress of every house. The idea in a lot of families historically, and maybe some today, the husband is in charge and the woman is subservient to them or below them, in bondage to them. Mill was trying to refute that. Mill had other sort of radical arguments. One was that we should go about as a country sacrificing our economic growth for the sake of nature and environment. Maybe, cutting down all of the trees or destroying the ozone layer or causing the greenhouse effect by progress, quote unquote, for economic growth isn't something we should do. He also felt that we should limit the population so that there's more living space and that the poorest of the poor are not starving, are not in terrible situations. And further than that, he said the working class itself, the population should be limited. This is the lower classes, so that the people who are working class can earn a good standard of living. They can make higher wages. It's a supply and demand. In generally speaking, there are many possible workers for few jobs, and as a result, they can pay very little. Mill, limiting population is not an argument that you hear a lot of, but he said it makes sense. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. And if you look at it from, people who said nothing when the Holocaust began or what have you in history, that good men do nothing is often a large issue. And our final quote from Mill to wrap up the PowerPoint: how can great minds be produced in a country where the test of great minds is agreeing in the opinion of small minds? And if you think about what school is, where you're just listening and being told what you should know, there's no originality, there's no individuality, and he thought a country can only blossom when people think outside the box. I hope you enjoyed the discussion on Mill. Please write a journal.